This is Judaism Unbound, episode 525, Dan's Stories, looking back on 10 years. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Libenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And this is my last episode as co-host of Judaism Unbound. That's a weird thing to say and a weird set of feelings. So what we're going to do today in this episode is essentially have a chance for me to have some thoughts looking back on 10 years of Judaism Unbound, and maybe we'll have some things to talk about together. So before we jump into that conversation, Lex, what are this week's unbouncements?
First, before the unbouncements, you're probably hearing in Dan's voice, and I think you'll hear in mine, a little bit of a weight to the conversation and some hesitation and fumbling. I'm actually going to not edit that fully out because I think that's raw and real for how we both are feeling in this moment. This is a major turning point for us, but I'm marking it. Dan, we love you. I love you. It's been an incredible 10 years. We're going to talk more about that and receive your wisdom, but it's a powerful moment for us and we're all filled with gratitude. But yes, unbouncements. We have Yeshiva courses that are here for you. We have many different 8-week options at your disposal. Judaism Unbound, our Intro to Judaism course, already started, but we have 5 other classes that begin very, very soon. With all of them, you are still able to register. So head to JudaismUnbound.com/classes to do so. But the classes are Magic and Medicine of the Psalms with Shefa Gold, Jews and Revolution on Socialists, Anarchists, and Radicals with Tony Michaels, Genesis, exploring the book of Genesis through themes of peoplehood and belonging with Amanda Mbuvi, and Everybody Beloved, a Jewish embrace of fatness with Minna Bromberg. We also have the class From Here to Ger, which is only available to those who have already taken Judaism Inbound, but it's our class where folks can vision and then start to actually execute the rituals for their conversion. So we've got amazing opportunities for you. Head to JudaismUnbound.com/classes to learn more. Financial aid is available. I will pass it back to Dan with some of that heaviness, with those mixed feelings, but also with some real eagerness to receive your words. Today, I'm mostly going to be asking shorter questions than I normally do, adding fewer of my glosses, maybe some, but not a ton. I'm excited to receive, in particular, some of your favorite stories from Jewish tradition that, in your eyes, are a good fit for this moment of exchange zone that we've been talking about, this baton pass from you to Rena Yehuda Newman. And so I'd love to throw it to you so we can get a sense of how you chose some of these stories that you're going to share with us today and why it felt like a fit to have this Sermon on the Mount episode from you be largely through storytelling.
Well, there's a part of me that wants to have a little bit of a look back and a wrap up. And there's part of me that wants to say, I want to think of other things. And then I'll say, hey, can I come on an episode of Judaism Unbound sometime as a guest? Part of the origin story of Judaism Unbound is that I had in mind to write a book and I couldn't do it. I couldn't figure out how to put all the ideas in order. I still struggle with that. So there's a desire to look back at this 10 years of work and say, what are some conclusions? And there's a part of me that just feels like that's not me. That's not probably us. That's not Judaism Unbound. That's not how this works. And so what can I do that would be helpful? And I think that I was thinking about really trying to connect what we've been doing here on the podcast to this larger tradition of what we've always done as Jews, which is to tell these stories about times of transition, and they may or may not be historical. And whether they're historical or not, they are definitely mythological, meaning that we don't mean for these stories to be only about the thing that they purport to be about, but actually something that we can think about metaphorically or symbolically. One thing that I'm reflecting on now that I wasn't really reflecting on when I emailed you, Lex, about wanting to focus on some of these stories was essentially the book of Deuteronomy, which purports to be this speech that Moses makes at the end of his journey, which ends before the people's journey ends, and says, I want to look back and tell you where we've been together. And by the way, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses retells that story in a lot of ways that are not consistent with the story as told in the other books. And I imagine that I'm going to do that today. So it's kind of a version of, okay, well, my time here is at an end. And so let me at least take an opportunity to tell you a couple of things that I'm thinking about. By the way, in particular, as Moses does, connecting it to these other stories, to these stories of that we've been through. And I want to say, by the way, lest I be accused of comparing myself to Moses, again, remember that I read these stories mythologically. So all of us are Moses. All of us are the characters. So yes, I can be Moses in the story. You can be God in the story. Somebody else can be Joshua in the story. That doesn't mean that you're claiming to be that person. That means that you're finding meaning in the story. It's speaking to you in some way. It feels like it's speaking about you in some way. And you're allowed to do that. And that's one of the big messages of Judaism Unbound.
Oh man, I love that. I hope we all are comparing ourselves to Moses for what it's worth. I think there are moments where he's actually not so great and others where he's deeply inspiring. But I love the Deuteronomy connection. I'll throw it back to you. Where are we starting? What's a first story, a first bit of Jewish tradition that you wanted to share with us in this transitional moment?
Well, there is this weird kind of obituary, elegy, valedictory sort of element to this that makes me a little uncomfortable. And yet it really asks in a deep way what this whole project was about. And I think that I wanted to start just by positioning what I think the Judaism Unbound project has been about, at least for me, which has always been marked by this analogy to the Exodus story, this idea that if we're reading the Exodus story mythologically, then it's a story. And by the way, B'nai and I and other people often quote Leon Kass, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, when we talk about this, because he wrote a beautiful line, which I'm only going to paraphrase in his book on Genesis, where he says, it's not a question of whether or not these stories actually happened. It's that this is how it always happens. And so the story of the Exodus is a story of how it always happens when we're trying to get from one place to another place. And that could be a physical place, but I want to talk about it not as a physical place, but as a place in history, as a place in one's thought, and a place in where we are as a community. And by the way, one of the things that makes me sad about trying to use the story of the Exodus as a metaphor is that so many people now think of it as not a metaphor, as, really about going to the land of Israel. And we can talk about it. Are we happy? Are we not happy that, we have land of Israel, state of Israel, all that stuff? And I'm like, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about the mythic dimension of this story. And in the mythic dimension of the story, Egypt represents a place that we have been that's not going so well. And the land of Israel represents a place that we want to go that we dream will be better. For me, there are three major stories Jews have told over the years of a path like that. The first is the story of Abraham being called to go from where he was from in Mesopotamia, Ur of the Chaldees, to the land of Israel. The second is the story of the Exodus going from Egypt to the land of Israel. And the third is not at all about that metaphor. It's actually the story of the rabbis having to reimagine Judaism when they had to go from a destruction in the land of Israel to a new reality, much of which is outside the land of Israel. We have these stories that take place in these transitions. And I think we talked a little bit about this a few weeks ago, that one of the things that really speaks to me is that we live in a wilderness period. We live in a time of transition, an in-between time. And it doesn't bother me to think that we live in a time that won't be remembered in history, that will be more remembered in story, where it's not necessarily that everything that we do is going to be archived and read in the future, but that we live in one of these times that you tell stories about. And one story that we haven't talked about that much is the story of Abraham being called, because there's two elements when Abraham is called by God. Again, I'm reading God mythologically. When Abraham listens to his calling and says, what am I here to do? And the first thing is, Lech lecha, go forth, go do it. Don't sit. Don't imagine somebody else is going to do it. you have a role in this. Get up and do it. And the other is that if you do that, you will be a blessing and you will be blessed. And I feel like I've heard this in different ways from Judaism Unbound listeners who've been inspired to not just feel like they don't fit well in Judaism as they've experienced it, but listen to certain episodes or listen to certain guests and say, I can actually do something different. And when they get up and do it, they are often a blessing to the thing that they're doing. They're often part of the solution. They're helping. And they're also blessed. Like they feel this sense of achievement, this sense of belonging. And that's a place that I wanted to start because, it's funny. I guess we did call our first episode Genesis, but I feel like the Exodus story has been more predominant in our thinking. And I'm just sort of thinking about the Abraham story in a new way.
We're only a little bit into this episode, and we've gotten deep wisdom from Deuteronomy, from Genesis, from Exodus. So hopefully Leviticus and Numbers are on their way. I know you've got some Numbers, Torah. Leviticus, you and I have spent some less time on, but we'll see. I thought you were going to go a different direction when you mentioned Deuteronomy, because it's a Greek word that kind of became an English word over time, and it's the second telling, the second story. And I thought what you were going to say is Moses tells a bunch of stories that have been told before, and you're going to tell a bunch of stories that you've told on the show before, but you're going to add new layers to them. So that's more like a call that if you have stories that you have told a bunch of times, that's not a problem. I'm appreciative that you brought some Abraham Torah when we've had less of it. But I guess I'm curious, are there other stories of yours that you've told once or twice or 10 times on this podcast that feel appropriate to bring in and maybe add today's particular gloss on them?
So I think I want to maybe back into some of the stories, or whether they're stories from the tradition or stories from my life, and think about like some of the things that I have been thinking about lately as I've started to hear from people. It's interesting to have this experience where people are kind of telling me what they have learned from me or what they think that I've taught them. And it's all true. It's all correct. But it's interesting that like when we talked with Rena Yehuda and you a couple weeks ago, you talked about how I have wanted to see this expansive Judaism, saying, Judaism's always bigger than I imagined. If I hear something that isn't the way that I think of Judaism, I don't say, I disagree with that. I hate it. I say, oh, I'm interested in that. And then I listen to it and I'm like, oh yeah, actually Judaism's even bigger than I thought. And that's an orientation that I have. And that's true. And in some of the social media and some of the emails about me that Miriam Turlinchamp drafted, it talks about my interest in Marie Kondoing Judaism, in tidying it up and making it less overwhelming. That's also true. I affirm that powerfully, that I believe in that. And it's funny because in a way, those two things are in some conflict with each other that I didn't necessarily notice before. And even when I heard you talking about the upcoming Yeshiva classes earlier when you were doing the unbouncements, I was thinking like, wow, there's so much. Like there's so many different things. And I started to have this feeling of like being overwhelmed. And I was like, how is this overwhelm different from the overwhelm that I think that Judaism Unbound is here to solve for people? It's a version of saying, hey, there is a lot of Judaism. There's so much of Judaism that no person, whatever they might claim, actually has it all and actually even has most of it. And so it may be overwhelming, it may be a lot, but the world is overwhelming. The world is a lot. We live in the world. It's okay. When you think about a life, when you think about a week, you end up saying, I'm going to do as much as I can. There is way more that you didn't do than you did do. And there always will be. And yet somehow people experience it or have been taught to experience it vis-a-vis Judaism as I must not be a good Jew or I must not really be able to do this. And I still don't quite know why that is, but I don't like it. With Judaism Unbound, in some ways, we have not addressed the amount of it so much. In fact, we've said there's even more than you thought. And yet, I think that we've tried to put it in context of saying, but you shouldn't be overwhelmed by it. You don't need to be overwhelmed by it. It's not that kind of thing. And I think in some ways, though, the Marie Kondo idea is saying, could we reduce this? Could we thin this down? Could we create a version of this that actually would not be overwhelming? That you could say, actually, I can do this. I can wrap my mind around the whole thing. I can understand it. It makes sense to me. It fits together. It's powerful. It makes my life better. And it defines me. And I can do it and I can be it. And what's weird is like, I want both of those things. And I'm not sure exactly how to reconcile them. And what's interesting is that I kind of feel like Judaism Unbound is kind of like the first part of that story. Like Judaism Unbound is the project that I've worked on that was about saying Judaism is way bigger than anybody thought, and you don't have to feel overwhelmed by it. And what I'm doing now, in some ways, is a little bit more like the Marie Kondo version, which is saying like, okay, but is there a version or a number of versions that actually are not overwhelming, that could be experienced as really powerful? I really value both of these projects, and I'm kind of mulling over, what is the nature of their ultimate synthesis, because I do believe in, grand unified field theories.
That's really cool. You're right. Like there is sort of a tension there, or I'm comfortable saying contradiction only because Judaism likes starting from contradictions and saying they're not really. Like I'm comfortable saying that's a contradiction in the way that lots of things in the Talmud are contradictions, but then the rabbis are like, no, we actually can solve it. And I think you found a way for us to live in both sides of that tension. I'm grateful to you for naming it, because I think there's that famous quotation, these and these are the words of the living God, ilu ve'ilu, et cetera, that people quote all the time. And it's referring to a particular moment where the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai are debating, and turns out they can both be words of the living God.
Right.
Cool. I think we don't always apply that in ourselves, right? Like we understand people as, there could be one person who thinks X and another person who thinks Y, and both can be words of the living God. Cool. What we don't always do is within one person, within one Dan, you can think X and Y, or
right.
even X and opposite of X. And that can be not only a contradiction. I think you just embodied the ways that can be the case. So I'm kind of grateful for it. What do you got next? What's another story from the treasure trove? Whether it's Jewish, I like that you said some of these will be Jewish tradition, others will be your own life experience. For us, that is Jewish tradition. You're a Jew and you have life experience. That's part of what Torah is. But what do you got for us next?
Well, that's a good segue to talking about, my favorite Jewish thinker, Clayton Christensen. Not Jewish. His name literally is Christensen. Yeah. But it was an important part of the beginning of our story, because in two ways. One was that these ideas, his book was The Innovator's Dilemma, and his theory is called Disruptive Innovation. That was something that had been meaningful to me around the time that we started the podcast, because I had had a set of experiences with the Jewish mainstream that were not good. And I had read those books, and I actually came away from those bad experiences with a kind of a sense of compassion for the mainstream organizations that, I felt had done me wrong, because I understood that they were actually not really able to do the thing that I wanted them to do. Reimagining Judaism in these more profound ways. Like that's just something that, for a whole host of reasons that Christensen explains, generally speaking, large organizations that have been around for a long time, they just cannot do certain things. And I had also been listening to a podcast around the same time, and that was kind of the origin of my sense like we should have a podcast, which was applying Christensen's thought to one of my favorite things in the world, which is Apple, the company. And I felt like, hey, let's try to apply those ideas to Judaism. I think that there's a lot of ideas, a lot of ideating, a lot of thinking in the Jewish world, whether the mainstream or the innovation world that we're talking about a lot of the time, that is kind of like wishful thinking. And I don't mean wishful thinking in the sense that it can't happen. I just mean it's mostly driven by wishing. And it's not in dialogue with science. It's not in dialogue with what actual scholars in fields like management science, innovation have discovered. Now, they might be wrong, but at least it represents the current thinking in disciplines that are actually really important to the work that we do. They're not thinking about how it applies to Judaism. And I don't know exactly why that is. I wish I did. I don't know if that's just common in all kinds of disciplines, and that maybe there's something in particular about Judaism, maybe about religion more broadly, where people say, like, this is a different walk of life. And so ideas that come out of management science or innovation theory don't apply because this is religion and that's about business. And I just think that that's like deeply wrong. It's frustrating to me that these things are not in dialogue with each other. And I'm curious, like, if we reflect back on 10 years of Judaism Unbound, have we moved the needle on that? Now, I say all this and I want to connect it to a story. I mean, for me, as you know, the spy story, the scout story is the big story that's about trying to achieve something difficult and seeing that there are obstacles in the way. And so what I'm trying to do by talking about how the Jewish community tends to be, oblivious about these kind of theories is not to throw cold water on something, but it's to say, how could we actually not see these as giants, as obstacles, but actually see them as just part of the story of how we're going to accomplish the thing? And my read of that story of the scouts, and that's where Moses sends these scouts into the land of Israel to scout out the land for 40 days.
And with that, we've covered the book of Numbers. So
yeah.
Challenge is Leviticus is coming somewhere along the way. You've got to figure it out.
I think we got to Leviticus during COVID, so we'll go there. But these scouts come back and they say, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, but there are all these giants that live there, there are all these obstacles, all these fortified cities, and we felt like grasshoppers and they saw us as grasshoppers and we're not going to be able to do it. And the question is, what is the solution to that problem? And for me, the solution to that problem it's not a problem that they identified the giants. The problem is that they articulated the vision as a land flowing with milk and honey, which is A, very abstract. What does that even mean? And B, is exactly the same vision that God gave Moses at the burning bush. So it's like they'd already heard that. So you went into the land for 40 days and 40 nights. You came back with the exact same information about what the thing is. And all you came back with was more stories about the obstacles that are going to prevent us from achieving it.
I mean, this is really gorgeous. I want you to finish this, but I want to note that you are somebody who knows biblical scholarship very well. And as you say this, that part of why we have two stories of the exact same thing is probably that they were two separate sources and not necessarily one that's being redundant and they've heard it already. But you are, even with that knowledge, you're saying, let's relate to this story as if it's one story, one coherent whole, and take that situation of two versions of the same thing and say, oh my gosh, they're actually being redundant and we can learn from that. You've actually done like a deeply Dan Libenson act there that I think is worth articulating.
Yeah, it may or may not have been an intentionally put there part of the story. But to me, the takeaway from it is that if you're going to scout something and you want to inspire people to fight to get it, you better describe that thing with such excitement, with such precision, with such concreteness, with such power that the people say, I will fight to get that no matter what is in my way. And then you say, okay, well, let's tell you what's in your way. Clayton Christensen says that can't be done because of the disruptive innovation theory. And then you're like, okay, well, does Clayton Christensen give us any ideas about how maybe it could be done in some way? And you're like, oh, yeah, actually, he does. He does there is a way to solve the innovator's dilemma. And once you're acknowledging the obstacle and saying there is science on this, but the science may also help us navigate it, now you're having a different conversation. I would love it if we were having that conversation in the Jewish community more than we are. And I think that it's actually both pieces. It's the serious conversation about the science, but it's also like, do we have visions in the Jewish community today that are that exciting? What would that look like? What would that feel like? And by the way, I'm not sure that is something that we have done on Judaism Unbound, except that we have, I think, in some ways given a vision of a Judaism that was more open, more loving, more capacious. And that is something. And I think a lot of people have been inspired by that and want that and are fighting for that. So I don't mean to say that we haven't provided a valuable vision, but I'm saying beyond that vision of just capaciousness, is there a vision of what your life could be if Judaism or Jewish wisdom or whatever we want to call it was deeply integrated in your life, and how would it be different, and how would it be better, and how would the world be better if... It's weird to me that we don't have more of that.
Yeah. I'm flashing back to a conversation we had not too long ago with Zach Kamenetz and Josh Libenson, where we talked about psychedelics, and we were talking about how people indicate that one of the reasons they try psychedelics is adventure, this potential for adventure. And that comes with risk. And we spoke about that too.
Yeah.
I believe that what you're talking about, and I'm inspired by what you're saying, whether or not we've done it in other respects. I'm really amped up and ready to like go to battle for what you're saying about having something that we can say so excitedly, so precisely, so powerfully that it has a magnetic pull to people and can't not create more abundant, more incredible, more meaningful Judaisms. I feel that from you. And so stories. I feel like I'm at like the part of the school day where we're sitting in a circle on the rug in kindergarten, and it's like, which book are they going to take off the shelf? But give us more. I don't even know what's about to happen. Tell me another story. If you cover the Leviticus base, great. But if not, and you're taking us into rabbinic text, or you're taking us into your own life experience, whatever it might be.
I'm trying to remember what we did say about Leviticus in when COVID started. I remember that when COVID started, I think we were just starting the book of Leviticus. At least in my mind, this is how I'm remembering, March of 2020.
And when you say we there, you mean the calendar of the Torah portions, not Judaism Unbound, which does align with that time of year being roughly the start of Leviticus.
Yeah, and I think like normally Leviticus is a book that doesn't speak to me because there aren't that many stories, there are almost no stories, it's just a lot of laws. And I sort of remember in those early days of COVID thinking like, yeah, maybe there's certain times when we need just some laws, like you should put a mask on or have social distancing, and sometimes there's a time for that. And I love how you put it in the context of the Elu ve'elu, like the these and these are both the words of God sort of orientation, because I think in a deep way that's core to the Judaism that I am inspired by. We can get more into that. But the idea that I am looking for a version of Judaism, at least for me, that has a version of some laws, rules. Now, I don't think that these are rules that should be imposed on me or on anyone by some kind of authority, whether that authority is God imagined as a daddy in the sky who is going to punish you if you don't do it this way. I don't like that at all. I also don't like it if it's imagined as the community will shun you if you don't do it this way, or maybe not as quite as bad as shunning. It will just make it harder for you to be part of this community if you don't do things in a certain way. I mean, for me, what's really powerful is the idea that, hey, if you don't do this, it's probably not going to work as you're hoping it's going to work. That's not imposed by God or by the community or anything. It's just a description of reality. And so I feel like there's a place for that. And there is a version of Judaism or Jewish wisdom that I believe in that says, hey, this has been around for a few thousand years. It's pretty much been engaged in the same set of questions that we struggle with today. And maybe we've learned a thing or two. And it's saying like, hey, you could do this a different way, but it's probably not going to work as well. I think there's a place for that. On the other side of the Elu ve'elu, these and these are both the words of God, is the freedom, right? Is the sense of you should be empowered to do what you find meaningful and what you think is right. And nobody should force you to do what you don't want to do. And so how do you sort of navigate this? Maybe it's the capaciousness of Judaism versus the sense that if Judaism has been around for 3,000 years and hasn't discovered a thing or two that actually probably makes sense to do, what's it been doing for 3,000 years? That would be kind of troubling to me if there was none of that. So that's kind of my Leviticus, I would say. But another story that relates to all this that I've talked about before in the podcast, but that's a really meaningful story to me from the Talmud, is a story of when Rabban Gamliel was fired from his job as the head of Yavne, which was the kind of R&D center or study center of early rabbinic Judaism. And Rabban Gamliel was the head of this place, Yavne. He was fired from his job basically because he was mean to a different rabbi that everybody really liked. And it turned out, though, that he had this admissions criteria to get into whether it was a school or an academy or just a kind of a think of it more like a job. Like to get a job there, you had to have these criteria. And the particular criteria that he had was that your insides had to match your outsides. And we could debate and discuss what that was all about. But the real story is that when they fired him, the new guy came in and said, we're getting rid of those criteria. In fact, we're getting rid of all criteria, apparently. And all of a sudden, tons and tons of people flood in and they want to be part of this. For me, that's an incredibly moving, relevant story, which is about like, what are we doing? And by we here, I mean all of us. What are we doing as Jews that we think is right, that we think makes sense, but that is having the function of keeping people out of Judaism? And I don't only mean non-Jews there that might want to convert. I especially also mean Jews that don't feel like there's a place for them in Jewish institutions, in Jewish life more generally, for a whole huge set of reasons. A lot of times that gets framed as the people that are keeping me out are very bad, and sometimes that's true. But a lot of times what's going on is that they're imagining that they're kind of holding the line on something important. They may be wrong, but they're imagining that they're trying to do something. And the other thing that they imagine is that the people that they might be keeping out, they're only a small number of them. And it's too bad that they feel left out, but we're not talking about a lot of people. And the story in the Talmud there is that when Rabban Gamliel left and his rule was changed, hundreds and hundreds of people flooded in, which was a huge number for that time. And then in the story, Rabban Gamliel says, oh my gosh, I have withheld the Torah from Israel. And he has this like sinking feeling that I thought I was doing something good with these rules, but I was actually doing something bad. And I wonder how that message could get out there more powerfully, that people could say, hey, maybe I'm doing something that I think is right, that I think, and by the way, there's a lot of fear that drives a lot of Jewish communal decision-making, that I was doing something, I was doing it this way because I was afraid that if I didn't do it this way, it would lead to your parade of horribles, assimilation, whatever. But actually, it was the opposite. But actually, it turns out that there's this hunger for some version of Judaism. It's not exactly the version that we're providing, so it doesn't feel to us like there's hunger, but there actually is hunger. And if we are willing to relax our notions a little bit about what this is, we'll actually see that there's a tremendous hunger out there. And I feel like that's something that has really stuck with me, and it's why I've been so committed to making the path to conversion so much easier as well.
Yeah, I remember the first time I heard you tell that story, which was also the first time I learned it. I hadn't been familiar with it from the Talmud. And it was extraordinarily powerful for me to hear because it wasn't only metaphor. It wasn't only, what if we understood Jewish life as being like this? I was thinking at the time about actual policies at actual yeshivas, actual places of Jewish learning that banned me and others from being part. The partner bans on people who are in interfaith relationships and have non-Jewish partners for a long time across the board at rabbinical schools. That meant you were not allowed to enter the yeshiva, and literally the gates were barred in the same way the Talmud had its policies. And sure enough, as those policies, thank God, since we've launched the podcast, have in many cases been overturned, it is in fact the case that we're seeing a flurry. I think more folks in such relationships than people realize that not only want to be part of Jewish life, but want to be leaders of Jewish life. And we're seeing that the tenor of Judaism generally shifts when you have people in those situations, in interfaith relationships and otherwise, that are holding leadership roles. We could also apply this to other legit policies that are not far in our past. Bans on queer folks in yeshivas, bans on women in yeshivas. Right. Like, all of the conversations we have about Judaism's immense changes and growth and beauty over the past, let's say, 55 years, which is roughly when the first, that takes us back to the first rabbinical school allowing women in. All of the shifts we're talking about are inflected by the fact that who is at the front of the room has changed. And the Talmud's front of the room is who's welcome in Rabban Gamliel's yeshiva. And so I'm really grateful for you bringing that. And I go on this long ramble because I think it's one example of many where you have told some beautiful stories and other people out there feel them as palpably, tangibly real to our lives. And so I wanted to share that for a second, but I'm going to keep my refrain going. Give us more rabbinic stories. I mean, I've got some like particular jokes you've made that are some of my favorites. Open floor. What do you got for us on the Jewish wisdom from rabbinic text, on your life experience? I'm asking the same thing I asked before, but once over, what do we got?
You really brought in the text of Elu ve'elu, and I want to dig more deeply into that one because the story is that these two schools of thought, Hillel and Shammai, disagree about everything. And at one point, they're having a disagreement, and a heavenly voice, right, the voice of God, comes down and says, Elu ve'elu, divrei Elohim chayim, like both of these and these are the words of the living God or the living words of God. Like they are both truth. And the path is the path of Hillel. Meaning that just because there are two contradictory truths and just because we affirm the two contradictory truths doesn't mean that we don't choose a path. We have to choose a path because to not choose a path is to have analysis paralysis, is to just be random. So now the rest of the story goes, why was the path of Hillel and not, for example, the path of Shammai? And the answer is that the school of Hillel had three traits or three behaviors. And they're translatable in different ways. So the first one is often translated as that the people in the school of Hillel, the school of thought of Hillel, were gentle and humble. It can also be translated as something like they were open and resilient. They could take a punch. You could punch them and they would get up again. Not physically punch them. You could punch them with words. You could.
The Chumbawamba school. When they get knocked down, they get back up again.
Right. I get knocked down and I get up again. Yeah. So that's number one. Number two, they would study their own views and the views of Shammai. And it's kind of straightforward to say, what does it mean to study the house of Shammai's views? But what does it mean to study your own views? In a way, a little bit, that's what I think we're trying to do today and model today, or I am, trying to say, like, what have I been saying for 10 years? Is it coherent? Is it actually making an argument? And the third is that they would give voice to the position of Shammai before giving voice to their own, which you could interpret in various ways. They let Shammai talk first, but I think that we generally think of it as that they would make Shammai's case for them better than Shammai themselves made the case for themselves. And I think that what that story is for me is it says, if you're thoughtful, if you're willing to listen to views that you don't agree with, or that you certainly don't agree with at the beginning, you'll ultimately find the better path. Sometimes you'll find that path because you will have listened to that other view and you'll have changed your mind. One of the things in that story is it says the path is the path of Hillel, but maybe the path is the path of Hillel because Hillel changed their minds. And in fact, I think there's another Talmud passage that says that that's actually the case. I think it might be Rashi that says, yeah, it was because the house of Hillel changed their minds. And so when they thought Shammai was right, they changed their minds. And so at that point, the path of Shammai became the path of Hillel. And so it became true that the path was always the path of Hillel. It doesn't say it was the original path of Hillel. It says that it was the path of Hillel that became the path of Judaism. But the other possibility is that you listen to the other side and you think about it and you find somewhere in between. And by in between, I don't mean a compromise. I mean that you just find somewhere that wasn't quite where you started, but also not where the other person was suggesting. I mean, I think that in some ways, like that's the ultimate legacy of me on Judaism Unbound that I wish that people would take away. That don't be afraid to hear something that you don't agree with, or certainly that you didn't come in agreeing with. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Like I just remember being so blown away by our conversation with Shefa Gold.
Whose class you can register for in the Onion Yeshiva on the Book of Psalms.
Oh yeah, right. And that wasn't even intentional. But like what she does, or one of the things that she does, chant, it was like not something that I had ever in any way considered, thought about, imagined in any way. And I came out of that conversation feeling like I could pray or do something that was, playing the role of prayer in my life if it was like this. And when I say prayer, I don't mean like praying to God, as imagined as some being that I'm talking to. Like, that's not what prayer is for me today, and I don't think it will ever be. And so I just kind of said, well, I guess I'm just not going to do that thing. And our conversation with Shefa Gold, I was like, this could be a thing that I do. One of the things that I really loved about chant, as opposed to prayer as we tend to know it in synagogues, is that for me, and especially for others who don't speak Hebrew or who can't remember a lot of words for whatever reason, the idea of just repeating a small number of words over and over and over again, I could do that. That was just like one example of an experience that the only way that I could have had that experience is because I came into that conversation with the attitude of the School of Hillel saying, I'm going to listen to this. And it changed me profoundly. I remember in our conversation with the folks from Gashmius magazine, which is this neo-Hasidic magazine, they introduced me to something which I have later come to understand is kind of like, everybody in Jewish Renewal knows this and would kind of roll their eyes when I said, like, I only found out about this like a couple of weeks ago. By the way, to make a digression, this reminds me of one of my favorite stories from Saturday Night Live ever, where this was in 1983. There was 20 years after the Kennedy assassination panel discussion, and there were 3 people on the panel. And they said, where were you when you found out that JFK was assassinated? And the first guy says, well, I was walking through my college campus and somebody came up to me and told me. And the moderator says, but you look like you're only about 30. I mean, how could that be? Were you like 10 years old and you were in college? And he's like, no. I'm kind of a jock and I wasn't paying attention to the news and actually just found out about this 10 years ago. Somebody told me. And then the next person on the panel says, I was just found out backstage. This guy told me. And then the third guy says, wait, are we talking about President Kennedy? Has something happened? So anyway, it's like you come to learn these things whenever you come to learn them. And I have no shame that I only learned this, a couple of years ago. But the thing that I learned was that in Hasidic thought, the word mitzvah is understood to come from the root not of tzivui or commandment, which most of us have learned it that way, but rather from the Aramaic word savta, which means togetherness, and that a mitzvah is an action that brings you closer in togetherness to someone. Now, often it's to the one, and however we interpret the one. And by the way, that's somewhere that I've come a long way in 10 years also in understanding, having an understanding of the one or oneness that's not God as a being out there, but, it's much closer to what yours, I've learned a lot from you on that one, Lex. But this idea that the Jewish actions that we might take, the mitzvahs, are actions that bring us closer maybe to that sense of oneness, to that sense of interconnection, but also potentially to the one that we are in relationship right now. In this case, Lex Rofberg and me, right? A mitzvah is something that brings us into connection. And I think that in that sense, we've done a lot of mitzvahs over the last 10 years. And we've, built this strong connection, by the way, as we've talked about, like over 2 decades of age gap. And that connection is built not by deciding to do it, not by wishful hoping, but it's really by one act after another. Something happens that's kind of mystical, right?
You were talking about Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, the schools of Hillel and Shammai, and you said that like maybe it's that Hillel's path is chosen because Hillel would sometimes change his mind or their mind. It's a bunch of people who follow Hillel that change their mind sometimes. So it doesn't necessarily mean the original path, but it could mean that the path is where Hillel ends up, which is often where Shammai was in the first place. And that feels like a good segue into me just expressing some of my gratitude to you. And I want to do so in the way I best do, which is through pun play or linguistic stuff. You helped me think about the word interview differently just now. I've used this word a million times the past few years and invited people to be interviewed on our show and talked with you about how we interview, etc. Inter-views. Like there's this way in which what an interview is an interface between different views, right? Like maybe I'm saying very basic things in the way you were saying, like, oh, like everybody in Jewish Renewal knows a certain thing, and it took me a while. Like maybe this is everybody walks around knowledgeable about this, and I'm just living in a strange world where I think of interview, the 3-syllable word, as separate from its prefix and its and whatever views is, it's not a suffix. But like, I am realizing that over the years, one of my favorite things, I have had many moments where your views have interfaced with mine and changed mine, where in the proverbial Beit Lex is now Beit Dan, but I call it Beit Lex because it started as you, but now it's both of us. That's happened lots of times. But my favorite moments when we're interviewing folks or when I'm just talking to people about my Jewish ideas are that I occasionally have things I'm saying where I know that either you or me said them once, and I don't remember which.
Yeah.
That is an interview. That is a gift I will never lose and that I'm so grateful for. Like the fact that you and I have been able to sort of incept each other. And because part of my theology is that like my goal is to transcend the notion of individual self. But my goal in everything is that I think that each of us as individual selves is kind of an illusion, and that we're all cells in a bigger body that is the sum total of all existence. And so walking around thinking I'm a self, I'm a Lex, I'm discrete and separable from the chair I'm sitting on and from the you that I'm talking to is not helpful. And so it is actually an achievement of my biggest theological goal when I occasionally have things I think that I don't even know if they're mine or yours. And the secret is they're not. That, like, even if they were yours originally, right, it could be that they're yours and they came to be through relationship with what I had said before. It could be if they're originally mine, they were really original. Like, there's something about what we have in this chavruta of ours where there is no original author, original speaker. So many things that we both think are not even traceable to who first said them. So I wanted to say that as a gratitude to you. There are so many ways in which who I am is not just who I am. It's you. It's not even you influencing me. I think it is pieces of you that have implanted. And for somebody that is as brilliant as you and has as much creativity as you, I am just so grateful that that can be true, that I can have those pieces as part of what I am and who I am. So I'm going to throw it to you for the last time this episode. I will give our outro at the end, but this is a chance for you to rally the troops in whatever ways you'd like. What's your call to action, your call to creativity, your closing story, whatever you've got for our Judaism Unbound listeners?
The thing that comes to mind, I mean, if we're gonna have this episode be about stories and sort of mythic texts that help guide us, there's this text that over the last few years has become really meaningful to me and also to B'nai Lappi. And I don't remember if we talked about it recently with B'nai, but it's a text, and it's interesting. It's from the perspective of the deathbed, which is not exactly why I'm thinking about it, but it's the deathbed of Rabbi Yehuda Newman, who was the person who compiled the Mishnah, which is your favorite book, Lex, or one of your favorite books. And there's this question about who is going to succeed him in one of his positions. He actually was holding 3 positions concurrently, and so he on his deathbed, he's dividing up his 3 positions, and it gives one. Not
so unfamiliar to us. He says to the founder and the co-host and the teacher and all the titles you've had.
Yeah, that's true. Right. So maybe this is more relevant than I thought. But he's dividing up his kind of roles to these different people. And he gives one role to one son and one role to another son. But the third role, he's deciding essentially between these 2 rabbis, Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Chia. And essentially he says, I'm going to give it to Rabbi Hanina because what Rabbi Chia does is so important that I can't put him in administration, that I have to keep him on the programmatic side. The Talmud says, what did he do that was so important? And they said, well, Rabbi Hanina would say, this is the guy who got the job, right? The guy who it was okay to put him in administration. He said, I'm so brilliant that if the Torah were ever to be forgotten, I would be able to put it back together. I'd be able to remember it all and reconstruct it. So you don't have to worry. With me in charge, if the Torah is ever forgotten, I can put it back. Rabbi Chia said, well, what I do is that I prevent the Torah from ever being forgotten from Israel in the first place. And here's what I do. I plant flax seeds and then I harvest the flax. And then I take the flax and I weave nets out of the flax. And then I use those nets to capture deer. And then I slaughter the deer and I feed the meat to orphans. But I take the hides and I write the 5 books of the Torah on them. And then I come to a city that doesn't have teachers, and I find 11 children, and I teach 5 of them, one apiece, each book of the Torah. We were talking about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? Each child learns 1 book and 6 other children, and I teach each of them 1 order of the Mishnah. There are 6 orders of the Mishnah. And I say, until I come back again, teach each other and teach each other. You know, this isn't mine anymore. I feel like that's a good way to end.
Wow. So there's a part of me that feels called to say, this absolutely is yours now and forever, because your imprint is permanent on this organization and we're deeply grateful for it. There's another part of me that wants to hold and receive what you said, because I'm honored and we're honored organizationally that you trust us, that we can be one of or all of the children that you have taught and that are holding down the principles that you have inculcated into the world. So I guess it's an ilu ve'ilu. You're right. This isn't yours. And also, this is and always will be yours. And both of those are true. Ilu ve'ilu divrei Elohim chayim. And we'll figure out the precise ways in which both of those are true in the coming weeks and months and years and even decades. I am just so moved to receive your wisdom today, but also every day for the last 10 years and the next 10 years in the new form of relationship that we will have. And I know that's true of our listeners, of your students, of our organizational partners and our guests, and so many other people out there. And so hopefully with the requisite amount of weight and honor, I am going to segue us to the practicals. Please send us your memories and gratitudes of Dan as co-host. We started with Moses, who dies in Deuteronomy, and you're not dying, thank God. So it's not the same exactly. And we do still want your memories, your gratitudes, the ways that Dan has moved you and touched your life over the years. And we made a Google form where you can submit those things. So bit.ly/Dan Unbound, no spaces. We really want all of those, both so that Dan can receive the honor that he more than deserves, and because we take seriously how important it is for us to be able to articulate what Dan's gifts and superpowers are. Because as he is not any longer in the co-host role, we still want to not just lose those superpowers. We want to be able as an organization to strive towards those gifts that he has and not just have them fall by the wayside. It would help us as we do that if you can say what they are. So head to that form, and also just feel free to email us. I always say email Dan@JudaismUnbound.com or Lex@JudaismUnbound.com. I think for this purpose, it's more important that you email Dan@JudaismUnbound.com to say directly to him the ways in which his Torah has moved you. So seriously, do that. Open the email, head to Gmail, head to Outlook, whatever your preferred modality, and send a note expressing what this moment is for you. And it feels like crass to do this, but part of Dan's legacy is also that he's created an organization that is not just him and that includes so many others. And so you're also, by heading to JudaismUnbound.com/classes and thinking about registering for one of our courses in the Onion Yeshiva, connecting, doing a mitzvah to channel Dan's meaning of mitzvah as connection. You are bringing that too. Whenever you relate to our work, you're relating to Dan in a sense. And so we hope you'll do that. We hope that you'll consider taking one of our courses that I mentioned at the top. All of our courses are starting between a few days from now and a couple weeks from now. So it's a good time to head to JudaismUnbound.com/classes. Financial aid is available. And mostly, consider yourself an unbounder. See yourself as part of this work that we're doing, because it goes so far beyond just Dan, just Lex, just Rena Yehuda, just Miriam, just our staff team, just our guests, just our teachers, just our certificate program students. It's all of you out there listening. So with a lot of mixed feelings and gratitude to Dan, with excitement for the future, I'll just say that this has been Judaism Unbound.